An 80-foot anomaly was strange enough on its own to make the team take notice. Then the scans went deeper and found two more, this time metallic, and this time impossible to explain away. Do you think the deeper a mystery goes, the more likely it is to have a real, satisfying answer, or the less likely, the further down you're willing to keep digging? And for everyone watching tonight, drop your city and age below. Let's see how far this one travels before the hour is out. Because what happened next didn't just add another strange reading to a long list of unexplained data points. It broke the math the entire team had been relying on to understand what was underneath them in the first place. It started with a number that seemed almost too clean to be a coincidence. Ground-penetrating radar scans run deep into the rock beneath one of the property's most heavily studied landmarks, picked up an anomaly sitting at roughly 80 feet below the surface. On its own, a single anomaly at a specific depth isn't unusual in this kind of survey. Rock formations aren't uniform. Density changes, moisture pockets, mineral deposits, all of it can produce a blip on a radar readout without meaning very much at all. The team had seen plenty of readings like that before, and plenty of them had turned out to be exactly that boring in the end. But this time, the team didn't stop at 80 feet. The plan called for going deeper, extending the survey further into the rock than they'd pushed before, chasing the possibility that whatever was producing that first reading might be connected to something larger sitting even further down. And that's when the numbers stopped behaving the way anyone expected them to. At around 290 feet inside one of the vertical boreholes the team had drilled specifically to investigate this region of the mesa, the scans found not one anomaly, but two. And unlike the first reading, these weren't ambiguous. According to the geophysicist reviewing the data, the two anomalies at that depth were clearly metallic, not a probable reading, not a reading that could plausibly be attributed to a change in mineral density or a naturally occurring mineral vein running through the rock. Clearly metallic, confirmed by the same equipment and the same specialist whose entire professional expertise is built around correctly identifying exactly this kind of subsurface signature. That distinction matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before getting into what happened next. Ground-penetrating radar has been used for decades in fields ranging from archaeology to civil engineering, specifically because it's reliable at distinguishing between different types of subsurface material. Rock reads differently than metal. Water reads differently than either. A trained specialist looking at that kind of data isn't guessing. They're interpreting a signature that has a known, well-established scientific basis. When that specialist says the anomaly is clearly metallic, that's not speculation dressed up as science. That's a professional judgment made using instrumentation specifically designed to make exactly that kind of determination. So now the team had two confirmed metallic anomalies sitting nearly 300 feet beneath one of the most closely studied landmarks on a property already known for decades of unexplained phenomena. That alone would have been enough to reshape the direction of the investigation. But the detail that actually stopped the room, according to how the moment was described afterward, wasn't just that the anomalies were there. It was what the depth of those anomalies implied about a drilling operation the team had already been running in that exact location. Here's where the math stopped adding up. The team had drilled directly into this area, specifically to investigate the mesa's subsurface, and based on the drill's own tracked depth, they should have already reached whatever was down there. If an object exists at approximately 290 feet and a drilling operation has already pushed to or past that depth in the same general location, the expectation is straightforward. The drill hits the object. That's simply how physical drilling works. You can't pass through solid metal without some kind of physical interaction registering on the equipment. Except that's not what happened. According to Dr. Travis Taylor, reviewing the data alongside the rest of the team, the puzzling part wasn't just that something metallic was down there. It was that the numbers indicated they should have already made contact with it, and they hadn't. No resistance recorded. No indication in the drilling data that the equipment had encountered anything beyond the surrounding rock. A confirmed metallic target sitting at a depth the drill had already reportedly passed through, with absolutely no physical evidence that contact had ever occurred. That's the kind of contradiction that doesn't resolve itself quietly. Either the depth measurements were wrong, which would raise its own uncomfortable questions about the reliability of instrumentation the team has depended on for years, or the object wasn't exactly where the radar said it was, despite a confirmed, clearly metallic signature, or, and this is the possibility that tends to get people's attention fastest, the drill somehow missed something that, by every available measurement, it should have run directly into. None of those explanations are comfortable. All of them point to a genuine, unresolved problem with how the team understood what was happening directly beneath their own equipment. Now, it's worth being transparent about something at this point, because credibility matters more than a dramatic cold open. This recap is built entirely around real events, documented in Season 7 of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch on History Channel, specifically the episodes centered on this exact GPR and borehole sequence. Every detail described here, the 80-foot reading, the two metallic anomalies at roughly 290 feet, Dr. Travis Taylor's observation that the drill should have already hit the object and hadn't comes directly from that episode's own data review, not from speculation layered on afterward. Nothing here is invented, and nothing here is rumor dressed up as fact. What follows is context, analysis, and an honest look at what this kind of finding could actually mean, built entirely on top of what the team themselves documented and discussed on camera. That distinction matters, because a story like this one doesn't need embellishment to be compelling. The actual confirmed sequence of events is strange enough on its own terms to understand why this particular anomaly landed with so much weight. It helps to understand just how much attention this specific landmark has already received across the show's run. Among every location on this 500-plus acre property, few have generated more sustained investigative interest than the massive rock formation dominating much of the landscape. Season after season, experiments conducted across the wider ranch have repeatedly produced unusual readings that seem to trace back to the same general area, as though whatever is generating the property's broader reputation for unexplained activity has some kind of relationship to this one specific landmark that the team still doesn't fully understand. Long before this particular season's drilling operation ever began, this landmark had already accumulated years of documented significance in the broader investigation. Earlier seasons described sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena appearing to enter and exit this same formation, observations that, taken at face value, would suggest some kind of interior space or passage that the team has spent years trying to locate and understand. Other seasons documented anomalous readings during helicopter-based surveys of the surrounding airspace, further reinforcing the sense that this landmark occupies a genuinely unusual role in whatever is producing the property's broader phenomena, rather than simply being an ordinary geological feature that happens to sit near other, more active locations. That accumulated history matters for understanding why the team was willing to commit as much time, expense, and logistical effort as they ultimately did to a full vertical drilling operation targeting this specific area. This wasn't a decision made lightly or in response to a single ambiguous reading. It was the culmination of years of circumstantial evidence pointing toward this landmark as potentially central to understanding the property's broader phenomena, evidence that had been accumulating steadily across nearly the entire run of the investigation, without ever quite reaching the level of certainty needed to justify this kind of invasive physical approach until relatively recently. Earlier ground surveys, conducted well before this season's borehole work began, had already detected unexpected underground signatures in this general region, readings that hinted at something structurally unusual beneath the surface without ever providing enough detail to say definitively what that something actually was. Those earlier surveys are part of what justified the far more invasive approach the team eventually committed to this season. Actual vertical drilling, sending a physical instrument down into the rock rather than relying exclusively on surface-level scanning technology that can only infer what's below rather than directly sampling it. That shift from remote sensing to physical drilling represents a meaningful escalation in the show's overall investigative approach. Surface scans, however sophisticated, always leave room for interpretation and alternative explanation. A borehole is different. It's a direct physical attempt to reach whatever is producing an anomalous reading. And by its nature, it's supposed to resolve ambiguity rather than add to it. That's exactly why this particular contradiction, a confirmed target at a specific depth with no physical contact registered, despite the drill supposedly reaching that depth, is so much harder to wave away than a simple surface reading would have been. This wasn't an indirect inference. This was supposed to be the moment where inference finally got replaced by direct physical confirmation. And instead, it produced a new and arguably more difficult question than the one the team started with. It's worth walking through what the team actually knew heading into this stage of the investigation, because it helps explain why they escalated to full borehole drilling in the first place rather than continuing to rely on less invasive scanning methods. Ground-penetrating radar, useful as it is, has real limitations when it comes to precisely characterizing what lies beneath the surface at significant depth. Signal strength degrades the deeper you go. Interference from mineral content, groundwater, and the surrounding rock's own density can distort a reading in ways that are difficult to fully correct for using surface equipment alone. A team serious about resolving genuine ambiguity in their data eventually reaches a point where surface scanning simply can't provide the level of certainty needed to move the investigation forward, and physical sampling becomes the only way to get a truly definitive answer. It's also worth understanding in a bit more technical detail exactly why ground-penetrating radar works the way it does, because that context makes the metallic classification even more significant than it might initially sound. GPR functions by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring how those pulses reflect back based on differences in the material they encounter. Different materials reflect these pulses differently based on their electrical conductivity and dielectric properties. Metal, being highly conductive, produces an extremely distinctive and strong reflection compared to surrounding rock, soil, or even most naturally occurring mineral deposits. That distinctiveness is exactly why a trained specialist can look at a GPR readout and confidently distinguish a metallic anomaly from, say, a pocket of unusually dense limestone or a natural vein of a less conductive mineral. It's not a subjective call. It's a well-established application of a physical principle that engineers and archaeologists have relied on for decades to locate everything from buried pipeline to ancient structures without ever needing to dig first. That technical grounding is part of why this particular finding is so hard to simply dismiss. If the classification had come from a more ambiguous or unusual detection method, it would be easier to write off as inconclusive. But GPR's ability to distinguish metallic signatures from natural geological material is about as well established as remote sensing technology gets, which means the clearly metallic language used in the original data review wasn't a dramatic flirt. It was a precise technical description of what the instrument actually detected. That's precisely the position this team found themselves in earlier this season. Years of surface level anomalies in this general area, combined with earlier GPR data hinting at something substantial buried beneath the mesa, eventually justified committing significant time, expense, and logistical planning to an actual drilling operation. Vertical boreholes aren't a casual undertaking, particularly on a property with this kind of remote location and this kind of geological complexity. Getting drilling equipment onto the property, positioning it precisely enough to target a specific subsurface anomaly identified through prior surface surveys, and then actually executing a deep vertical bore represents a substantial escalation in both resources and risk compared to the team's earlier, less invasive investigative methods. Given that level of investment, it's worth appreciating just how significant it is that the drilling operation produced a genuine contradiction rather than a clean resolution. In an ideal outcome, the borehole would have simply confirmed what the earlier GPR survey suggested, hit whatever object or material was producing the anomalous reading, and given the team a physical sample or direct measurement to work with going forward. Instead, the borehole produced exactly the opposite of that clean resolution. It confirmed that something was there through continued GPR scanning conducted from within the borehole itself, while simultaneously failing to produce the physical contact that same data suggested should have already occurred. That's not a minor technical footnote. That's a fundamental contradiction between two different measurements the team was relying on, both generated using instrumentation they've trusted for years. And contradictions like that don't resolve themselves through wishful thinking. They require the team to seriously reconsider at least one of their underlying assumptions about how their equipment is performing, how accurately depth is being measured and tracked during a drilling operation of this complexity, or in the most unsettling scenario, whether something about the object itself is behaving in a way that doesn't match how solid stationary metal ordinarily should behave when a drill bit approaches it. It's worth talking through each of those possibilities individually, the same way any serious investigation has to before reaching for the most dramatic explanation available. Because this kind of contradiction genuinely does have more than one plausible resolution. There's the measurement error explanation, which has to be the first possibility considered any time equipment produces results that don't match physical reality as expected. Drilling depth isn't always as precisely tracked as people assume. Depending on the equipment used, minor calibration drift, mechanical slippage, or accumulated small errors over a multi-hundred-foot bore could produce a meaningful discrepancy between the depth the equipment reports and the depth the drill bit has actually reached. If the true depth of the borehole is somewhat different than what's been logged, the drill might simply not have reached the anomaly yet, despite the tracked numbers suggesting otherwise. That's an unglamorous explanation, but it's also the kind of explanation that real engineering projects run into constantly, and it wouldn't be surprising if it turns out to be at least part of what's going on here. There's the positioning explanation, which addresses a different part of the same contradiction. Ground-penetrating radar provides a strong indication of depth, but it can be considerably less precise when it comes to pinpointing exact horizontal position, especially at significant depth where signal scattering becomes more pronounced. It's entirely possible that the object the GPR detected sits at approximately the depth reported, but slightly off to one side of the borehole's actual path, close enough to register clearly on radar scanning conducted from within the nearby borehole, but not directly in the drill's exact trajectory. If that's the case, resolving the contradiction might simply require redirecting the drilling operation slightly, rather than requiring any explanation more extraordinary than an understandable limitation in how precisely GPR can localize a target at that kind of depth. And then there's the explanation that doesn't reduce cleanly to either measurement error or positioning uncertainty. The possibility that something about this specific situation doesn't conform neatly to conventional expectations at all. This is the property, after all, that has spent decades generating exactly this kind of unresolved contradiction, season after season, investigation after investigation. A confirmed metallic signature at a specific depth paired with a drilling operation that appears to have physically reached that depth without registering the expected contact fits into a much longer pattern this show has documented repeatedly. Instrumentation behaving in ways that seem internally consistent and reliable right up until the moment they contradict each other in ways nobody can immediately resolve. It's worth being precise about what this third possibility actually implies, rather than letting it collapse into vague, undefined mystery for its own sake. If measurement error and positioning uncertainty both get reasonably ruled out through the team's planned follow-up scanning, what would remain is a situation where a confirmed solid object occupies a specific physical location that a drill bit, by all available tracking data, has already passed through without any physical interaction occurring. That's not simply unexplained in a vague sense. That's a direct contradiction of basic physical expectation about how solid matter behaves when another solid object is driven directly into the same space. Resolving a contradiction at that level would require either identifying a specific technical explanation nobody has yet proposed, or accepting that something about this specific object or this specific location behaves in a way current models don't adequately account for. None of these three explanations are confirmed at this point, and the team themselves, based on how this data review was actually documented, haven't settled on either. What they have done is treat the contradiction seriously enough to plan further investigation, specifically designed to resolve it. additional GPR scanning run directly down the vertical boreholes themselves, an approach intended to get a more precise read on exactly where these metallic anomalies sit relative to the drill's actual path, and, by extension, a better sense of which of the three explanations above is actually correct. Once the additional data has been collected and properly analyzed, that next step matters because it reflects how this particular team tends to operate when they run into a genuine data contradiction rather than a straightforward anomaly. They don't jump straight to the most dramatic possible interpretation. They design a more targeted follow-up experiment, specifically capable of distinguishing between the mundane explanations and the more significant one, running GPR scans directly down the boreholes, rather than relying exclusively on scans conducted from the surface or from adjacent boreholes, should, in principle, provide considerably more precise data about exactly where these anomalies sit and whether the drilling equipment's reported depth can actually be trusted at this scale. It's worth remembering, too, who was in the room evaluating this contradiction because it shapes how seriously it deserves to be taken. Dr. Travis Taylor has spent years on this investigation functioning as one of its most consistently skeptical voices, someone whose entire professional background as an astrophysicist has trained him to look for the mundane explanation before entertaining anything more extraordinary. When a researcher with that kind of consistent track record describes a finding as puzzling, specifically because the underlying numbers don't reconcile with the physical evidence, that's a meaningfully different kind of statement than a casual reaction to an unusual reading. It reflects someone who has already run through the likely mundane explanations in his own head in real time and still found himself with a contradiction he couldn't immediately resolve. The rest of the team present for this data review brought their own relevant expertise to the same table. Eric Bard, the investigation's principal investigator, has spent years overseeing the property's broader research strategy and has developed a strong working sense of which anomalies tend to resolve into mundane explanations and which ones tend to hold up under further scrutiny. The geophysicist responsible for the GPR analysis itself brought the kind of specialized technical background needed to distinguish a genuine metallic signature from a false positive in the first place. When a finding manages to genuinely puzzle a group with that combined range of expertise, all evaluating the same data independently before comparing notes, that collective uncertainty carries real weight separate from whatever the eventual explanation turns out to be. It's worth naming the full group present for this particular review because the range of roles represented says something about how seriously this specific finding was treated compared to a routine data check. Alongside Dr. Travis Taylor and Eric Bard, the review included additional team members with backgrounds spanning engineering, technical operations, and hands-on equipment management, the kind of cross-functional group that typically only convenes when a finding is significant enough to warrant input from every relevant discipline at once, rather than being handled quietly by a single specialist and reported up the chain afterward. That kind of full group review is itself a signal, independent of the specific content of the finding, that this wasn't treated as a routine technical hiccup. It's also worth considering how this specific team's dynamic tends to function when a genuine disagreement or uncertainty arises during one of these reviews. Over the course of the show's run, viewers have seen this group work through plenty of ambiguous data together And the pattern that tends to emerge is one of genuine, unscripted feeling debate rather than uniform agreement. Team members with engineering backgrounds tend to push hardest for mundane, mechanical explanations first. Team members with a more research-oriented background tend to be somewhat more willing to sit with unresolved uncertainty rather than rushing toward a premature explanation in either direction. That internal tension playing out in real time across a shared table of data is part of what makes a moment like this one feel like an authentic disagreement between trained professionals rather than a manufactured dramatic beat inserted for the cameras. There's a broader pattern worth acknowledging here as well, one that longtime viewers of this investigation will likely recognize immediately. This isn't the first time this specific team has run into a contradiction between what their instruments predicted and what their physical investigation actually confirmed. Over the course of the show's run, similar patterns have played out repeatedly. A strong, confident reading from one type of instrument, followed by a physical investigation that either fails to confirm it cleanly or produces results that complicate rather than simplify the underlying question. That pattern doesn't prove anything about what's actually happening beneath this mesa, but it does suggest that whatever is generating these anomalies, whether it's a consistent limitation in how the team's equipment performs under the property's unusual conditions, or something about the property itself that resists straightforward investigation, this contradiction fits into a much longer and more consistent pattern than a single isolated data point would represent on its own. That consistency is, in its own way, almost more significant than any single anomaly could be by itself. A property that occasionally produces one strange, unexplained reading might reasonably be attributed to a long string of individually explainable coincidences, equipment errors, and misinterpreted data. A property that has spent years consistently producing exactly this same category of contradiction across multiple different investigative teams, multiple generations of increasingly sophisticated equipment, and multiple entirely types of instrumentation, starts to look less like a coincidence and more like a genuine, if still poorly understood, pattern worth taking seriously on its own terms. There's a specific reason this pattern deserves more weight than it might initially seem to warrant, and it has to do with how independently these various investigative efforts have actually been conducted over the years. This property wasn't investigated by a single continuous team using a single unchanging methodology from the beginning. Different research organizations using different equipment, different personnel, and often entirely different theoretical starting assumptions have each independently arrived at broadly similar conclusions that something about this land resists straightforward investigation in a way that goes beyond what equipment error or coincidence alone should reasonably produce over that many separate, independent attempts. When multiple different groups, operating without coordination and often years apart, keep running into the same fundamental category of contradiction, that convergence is itself a data point worth taking seriously, regardless of how any single instance is eventually explained. That's part of why this season's borehole findings landed as significantly as they did with longtime viewers of the investigation. It's not simply that a strange reading occurred. It's that the reading fits into a decades-long pattern of similarly strange, similarly unresolved readings, all pointing back toward the same general conclusion, that this specific landmark more than almost anywhere else on the property, seems to generate exactly the kind of contradiction between expectation and physical reality that has defined this entire investigation since long before the current team ever arrived. So here's where the investigation currently stands, based entirely on what's actually been documented and confirmed. Two clearly metallic anomalies sit roughly 290 feet beneath one of the most heavily studied landmarks on this property, a formation that has drawn more sustained investigative attention across this show's entire run than almost anywhere else on the ranch. A drilling operation specifically designed to physically reach that depth appears to have done so, according to its own tracked measurements, without registering the contact that should have accompanied reaching a solid metallic object. The team has identified this contradiction, discussed it seriously, and committed to a specific, more precise follow-up investigation intended to resolve exactly what's producing it. Whether that follow-up eventually reveals a straightforward measurement or positioning error, or something considerably hard to explain using conventional engineering assumptions, remains genuinely unresolved as of this recap. What's not in question is that the contradiction itself is real, documented, and taken seriously by a team with more collective expertise and more accumulated skepticism than almost any other group currently investigating unexplained phenomena anywhere in the country on a property that has earned every bit of that scrutiny across decades of similarly unresolved findings. If your own equipment told you something was sitting exactly where your drill had already been, and the drill itself found nothing there, would you trust the reading, trust the drill, or start to wonder whether something about the situation itself doesn't play by the rules either piece of equipment was built to expect in the first place? And if a property kept producing exactly this kind of unresolved contradiction year after year, investigation after investigation, never quite letting either explanation win outright, would that be enough to keep you watching for the follow-up? Or would you want a straight answer before you let yourself get invested any further into a mystery that by every indication so far still isn't finished unfolding?